Hi guys, welcome to your reptile video notes. So we're going to first start by talking about amphibians versus reptiles, and this is all about the egg. If you remember, amphibians are still connected to water. They have to reproduce using water. They have tadpoles that live in water, but amphibians live outside of water in most cases. So they have to have a way for their eggs to be able to develop and survive. So this is where a membrane is thought to have developed around the embryo of an egg, thus resulting in an amniotic egg. So Amniota is a monophyletic group. This includes the reptiles, birds, and mammals, all of which are the organisms we will still cover. So here's just a closer look at that amniotic egg, and this is very similar to the egg that we have as humans. We just don't have a shell around ours, but reptiles and birds do have shells. And just some of those membranes. So the amnion itself is what protects the egg from drying out. All of the other factors are also important. And something to know is leathery or hard shells. These are what is in birds and reptiles, which is why they're still able to have these eggs outside of their body, whereas mammals don't have this, so they have that layer inside of their bodies. So when we talk about the different vertebrates that we've discussed so far, fish don't have a neck and they can't turn their head independently. Amphibians have a single neck vertebrae and two pivot points, but they really can't do much than nod up and down. Reptiles are the first time we're seeing vertebrates that are able to move their head both vertically and horizontally. So here's just a look at also the different vertebrae and how the different bones have evolved over time. So we start up here with a bony fish, then you have four-legged ancestors, amniote ancestors, to finally we get to mammal-like reptiles. So let's take a closer look at the different skulls of amniotes. So there's a synapsid, which is one temporal region, and this has attachment for jaw muscles. So this is a mammal lineage, and it's this picture here. You have anapsid, which are what the earliest reptiles had. So they didn't have any openings in the temporal region. And all extinct reptiles have this, except turtles do have this shell as well. We also have the diapsid skull, which is where reptiles, dinosaurs, and birds come in. So here's just another look at those different kinds of skulls. So you have a monitor is down here, T-Rex is up there, you have a bird skull, and then a crocodile skull. Some synapsid skulls, so like we said, these are mammals. So look at the human versus a horse over here versus a black bear, and then a mammal-like reptile. So here's just a look as well at that phylogeny. So we're looking at the breakdown of the different types of reptiles. So all of these different orders we'll get into, and you see Crocodilia, which are the crocodiles, turtles, squamates are lizard-like. So all of those things have that diapsid skull. So if we're looking a little bit more at the skulls, we have a primitive reptile which has diverged into these different types of skulls. So you see turtles, you see pliosaurs, ichthyosaurs, mammals, and then all other reptiles. So let's get a little bit more into birds and reptiles. So birds are actually reptiles with wings. So there's been a lot of recent evidence as well that birds are actually reptiles. They have that single occipital condyle. They have single ear ossicles, a lower jaw structure. They don't have that secondary palate in the roof of their mouth. And they also have a lot of genes and proteins in common. So technically, there's a classification referred to as non-avian reptiles and avian reptiles. Let's get into class Reptilia now. So just a little bit of an overview. There's many adaptations that reptiles have for life on land without having a connection to water. So first we have the amniotic egg that we discussed, but they also have those watertight scales made from keratin. One occipital condyle, which is that point of attachment that allows for much more mobility of the skull. They have a water-conserving kidney for life away from water, a three-chambered heart, although crocodiles have four, claws for digging and locomotion. They have a much better respiratory system, and that lateral line system that's in fish and some amphibians is also disappearing. So let's look a little bit more at the scales of reptiles. So if you see, they are watertight and they have the way they hinge to each other. This prevents them from losing water, but also prevents them from getting a lot of water into their systems. So let's start getting into some of the orders. So order Testudines, these are turtles and tortoises. They have a bony shell, and their limbs are actually internally attached to the ribs, which are attached to the shell. They have a keratinized beak instead of teeth. So turtles don't have teeth, but they have the fusion of many of their bones. So their vertebrae, their ribs, and their skin bones all form plates. So the top of the shell is a carapace, which is what you see on this turtle here. And the bottom of the shell is where the pectoral girdle is, and this is the plastron, which you see here. So here's a closer look at just the skeleton and shell of turtles. So you can see their neck, it's actually adapted to bend into an S shape inside of their shell, which is why when turtles are scared or they want to hide, they just pull everything into their shell and they're protected. Next up is order Crocodilia. So there are 21 living species in this order. They include crocodiles, alligators, caimans, and gavials. So they're anatomically closer to birds and dinosaurs than any other reptile. They're also very old. They've been on this planet for a very long time and unchanged actually for 170 million years. So here's just an example of some of those different species as you see, and here's a closer look at how they differ. So a lot of people talk about crocodiles versus alligators, so you can see the difference, especially look at the shape of the snout from overhead of a crocodile versus an alligator. And then the caimans look a lot like an alligator, and then the gavials look very different. The crocodile heart, like we talked about, also has 4 chambers, so it's much more adapted to diving and surviving underwater. So when diving, you see the blood flow difference on the right-hand side versus when they're under normal conditions on the left-hand side. Crocodiles also have some other adaptations you should be aware of. So they have that elongated snout that we associate with alligators, crocodiles, everything, right? So this helps them with capturing their prey and sideways motion. Also, I'm sure you know this, their nostrils and eyes are on top of their skull so they can breathe while they're mostly submerged underwater. They have an epiglottis at the back of their tongue, which has that watertight seal, so that way when they open their mouths, they're not swallowing water. They have a bone that separates their mouth and nasal cavities, and they eat their prey whole. So they actually swallow rocks in addition to their prey to help break up their food. And then, of course, that strong tail that you see, which helps them with swimming, defense, hunting, everything. So these adaptations themselves have allowed them to be the largest of all modern reptiles, and they're also very successful. They've been around for millions of years. So they have a very efficient nervous, circulatory, and respiratory system as well, which helps them grow larger and have more activity for longer lengths of time. There is a Nile crocodile in Africa, which is thought to be the largest living crocodile, and you can see him over here in this picture. So the next order is Phenodontidae. Now this is only 2 surviving species to this order, and they're called the Tuatara, and there's 2 different kinds of them, but the name itself means wedge tooth, and they look kind of like bearded dragons, but they live only on a few islands in New Zealand. They're lizard-like in their appearance due to convergent evolution, so they've been unchanged for 200 million years, but they are lizard-like in appearance from an evolutionary standpoint. So the tooth attachment and that structure is very different from other reptiles. They have 2 rows of teeth on their upper jaws and just a single on their lower jaws. They also have a very well-developed parietal eye, which has a lens and a retina, so it can actually see way more than just the eyes on other lizards, which I'm sure you're aware of. If you've been around Zemo, we've talked about his eye that he has on top, that he can see shadows, but he can't actually focus in on images. These lizards can. So they're also, of course, very much in danger. So they live in burrows and they come out at dusk and dawn to feed, but they used to be all over New Zealand, and now they're only left on a few small islands. And the issue is rats. So rats have hitchhiked over to these islands, and they eat the young, and they are competing for prey. There are, though, fortunately, many captive breeding programs, but in terms of the wild reptiles, there's not that many left. Next up is order Squamata. So these are lizard snakes and worm lizards. So they diverge from lepidosaurs, and there's 3 suborders. So suborder Sauria is the lizards, Serpentes is the snakes, and Aphisbaena is the worm lizards. So fun fact for you, snakes actually cannot eat adult humans. There have been people that have claimed they eat children, but an adult human is not the case. They can kill you, of course, but they cannot actually swallow you because adult shoulders are too broad to allow this. But like we mentioned, some species may try. There is one case where someone was documented as being killed and attempting to swallow a human victim, but this is the only documented case of this happening. So in terms of snake evolution, so snakes are believed to have evolved from burrowing lizards. So losing their limbs and their protective eye scale would have helped them to burrow more successfully. So the snakes that were able to do that are the snakes that passed on their traits and they continue to reproduce, which is where we have snakes that have all these reptile characteristics but no legs. And it's interesting to note that some primitive snakes like boas and pythons, they still have a vestigial pelvic girdle where legs used to be. So the external structure itself of lizards, their skin has no respiratory function like amphibians, and their scales prevent that water loss, but they do shed, and this is ecdysis. This should not be a new term to you. They also have longer skulls, and they have a plate of bone that separates their nasal and mouth passages. They have increased movement, like we've talked about, and most of their limbs extend laterally out instead of just directly underneath them like mammals, which helps them to move more on a horizontal plane. And some primitive reptiles, it's important to note, were bipedal, meaning they walked on two legs. So in terms of nutrition, there's many modifications. Reptiles eat many different kinds of prey. They can be herbivores, omnivores, carnivores. Like we talked about, turtles do lack teeth, but they have beaks that are able to still bite and crunch on food. Some lizards also have sticky tongues, like this chameleon here, that they can use to capture prey. So in terms of their circulation, reptiles are 2 times the size of amphibians, and this requires the blood to travel under a much higher pressure. So most reptiles do have a 3-chambered heart, but they are able to pump this blood throughout their bodies more efficiently than amphibians. Here's just a look at the different hearts. So you see amphibians, 3-chambered here, versus a 3-chambered chamber with a septated, and then 4-chambered with birds and mammals. In terms of reptile circulation then, that incomplete separation of blood allows them to move some blood from the pulmonary to the systemic circuit. So the advantage is reptiles only breathe intermittently, but the disadvantage is there's still some missing of blood in the parietal septum of the ventricle. Crocodiles, though, remember, have a 4-chambered heart, so they have that complete separation that makes them so successful. Here's just a look at the different hearts. You may want to pause this here and examine this diagram. In terms of respiration, reptiles use negative pressure breathing, and they do something called body cavity breathing. So they don't have a diaphragm like we do, so they pull air into their lungs and use their body cavity to push air in and out. They also have no alveoli like mammals, but they have more folds, which allows for more surface area. And in terms of temperature regulation, which I'm sure you're well aware of from being in the classroom, is reptiles, they're able to live in much different environments than amphibians due to not having to depend on water, but they also have to depend on temperature. So they thermoregulate by behavior. If it's cold, they're going to bask in the sun, and if it's hot, they're going to go in the shade. They can also hibernate when the temperatures drop too low, and they go into something called torpor, which is reduced activity. It's kind of like hibernation. And when they do hibernate, they often do this with others. So there's rattlesnakes that have often been seen in the area, and they go into a hibernaculum, which is where all of them hibernate together to regulate heat. For nervous and sensory functions, the parietal eye is something that is so important to reptiles, and I'm sure you've seen this on Zima. This actually is an iguana in this picture, so it looks very similar. So it helps them collect light, and then, like we said, the tuatara can see images. They also have tympanic membranes, so they can hear airborne sound, especially predators or different things that could be a problem. Snakes don't have a middle ear, so they actually can't hear. They only detect things through their jaws. And most lizards have something called Jacobson's organ, which is in the roof of their mouth. So if you've had Zeke or Zima out, you see how they flick their tongue all the time. They're not tasting you, they're actually smelling you. In terms of excretion, they have metanephric kidneys, which work under that high blood pressure and is why they conserve water. They produce uric acid, which is very similar to bird waste, and they have salt glands to help get rid of excess salt. In terms of reproduction, we talked about the amniotic egg. They're dioecious and they have internal fertilization.